December 24th, 1914. The Western Front. You're in a trench, a ditch carved into the frozen earth of Belgium, 7 feet deep, barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. The walls are shored up with wooden planks and sandbags, but they're crumbling in places. Water seeps through constantly. The floor is a soup of mud and filth that sucks at your boots with every step. You haven't been warm in weeks. You haven't been dry in longer. The greatcoat you were issued is caked with mud, stiff with it, and it stopped keeping out the cold sometime in November. Your feet are numb. You've stopped checking them because you don't want to know what they look like. The man next to you is sleeping sitting up, his back against the trench wall, his rifle clutched to his chest. There's nowhere to lie down. The dugouts are full. The communication trenches are full. Every dry spot, every remotely dry spot, has a body in it, living or dead. The smell is something you'll never be able to describe to anyone who wasn't here. Death and decay and human waste and rotting food, and the particular stench of mud that's been mixed with blood and cordite. You don't notice it anymore, most of the time. It's just the smell of the world now. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, across a wasteland of craters and barbed wire and bodies that can't be retrieved, the German trenches mirror yours, men just like you, freezing in ditches, waiting. The war is 5 months old. Everyone said it would be over by Christmas. The politicians promised, the generals assured, the newspapers predicted. Home by Christmas, they all said. A quick war, a decisive victory, and then back to normal life. It's Christmas Eve, and there's no end in sight. And then you hear something impossible. Across no man's land, from the enemy trenches, someone is singing. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night. What followed was one of the most extraordinary events in military history. Along hundreds of miles of the Western Front, not everywhere, but in dozens of sectors, involving thousands of men, the shooting stopped. The war paused. And something unprecedented occurred. Enemies emerged from their trenches. German soldiers climbed out of their positions and walked into no man's land. British soldiers did the same. French soldiers in some sectors, Belgian soldiers in others. They walked towards each other across the frozen wasteland, across ground that had been a killing field for months, and they met in the middle. They shook hands. They exchanged cigarettes and chocolate. They shared whatever food they had. They showed each other photographs of their families, wives and children and sweethearts, the people waiting for them at home. They tried to communicate despite the language barriers, mixing German and English and French, using gestures when words failed. In some places, they played football. In some places, they buried their dead together, working parties from both sides, digging graves in the frozen ground, giving dignity to bodies that had lain in the open for weeks. They sang carols. They lit candles. They celebrated Christmas together. For one day, in some places, several days, the war simply stopped. Not because generals ordered it, not because politicians negotiated it, not because anyone in authority sanctioned it, because ordinary men on both sides decided they were done killing each other, at least for Christmas. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories, these forgotten moments, these stories of humanity in the midst of horror are worth remembering, if you believe that the past has something to teach us about who we are and what we're capable of, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit. It allows us to keep exploring the places where history and humanity intersect. Tonight, We return to the winter of 1914 and the frozen trenches of the Western Front. We'll explore how the Christmas truce happened, the carols and the candle-lit trees that started it, the extraordinary scenes that followed. We'll meet the men who participated, hear their words from letters and diaries written in the days after. We'll witness the football matches played in the mud of no man's land, the burials that finally gave peace to the dead, and we'll confront the tragedy that surrounds this moment of grace. The war that continued for 4 more years after that Christmas Eve, the millions who died in the battles that followed, the commanders who made absolutely certain that nothing like the Christmas truce would ever happen again. The truce lasted a day. The war lasted until 1918. By the time it ended, 17 million people were dead. But for one night, one cold, clear night in December 1914, enemies became friends. The guns fell silent, and men who were supposed to hate each other discovered they were just men. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. The war began in August. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had set off a chain reaction of alliances and ultimatums that no one seemed able to stop. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. Britain entered when Germany invaded Belgium. Within weeks, most of Europe was at war, but everyone thought it would be quick. Home by Christmas was the phrase on everyone's lips. German soldiers chalked it on the railway cars carrying them to the front. British volunteers enlisted with the cheerful assumption that they'd see some adventure and be back before the new year. French soldiers marched off to recover Alsace and Lorraine, lost to Germany in 1871, confident that this time victory would be swift. The generals had plans, elaborate plans, refined over years of peacetime preparation. The German Schlieffen Plan would sweep through Belgium, encircle Paris, and knock France out of the war in 6 weeks. Then the German armies would turn east and deal with Russia before the slow mobilizing Russian army could fully deploy. 6 weeks. That was the timeline. A war of movement, of decisive battles, of clear victories. No one planned for trenches. No one planned for stalemate. No one planned for the nightmare that the Western Front would become. The plans failed almost immediately. The German advance through Belgium was slower than expected. Belgian resistance was fiercer. The British Expeditionary Force, small but professional, fought delaying actions that bought crucial time. The French, reeling from their own failed offensives, managed to regroup. The Battle of the Marne in early September stopped the German advance just short of Paris. It was a close thing. Taxis were commandeered to rush French reinforcements to the front, but it worked. The Germans fell back. The war of movement was over. What followed was called the race to the sea, both sides trying to outflank each other, extending their lines northward toward the English Channel. Neither succeeded. By October, the front stretched from Switzerland to the sea, and neither side could find a way around. So they dug in. Trenches appeared first as temporary shelters, holes scraped in the ground for protection from artillery. But temporary became permanent. The holes became ditches. The ditches became systems. The systems became a continuous line of fortifications that neither side could break. The war of movement had become a war of stagnation. The adventure had become a nightmare, and there was no end in sight. The trenches were not the clean ditches of imagination. They were hell on earth. The mud was omnipresent. This was Flanders. flat and low and wet, where the water table sat just below the surface. Dig a trench and it filled with water. Pump it out and it filled again. The mud was a living thing, thick, clinging, sometimes waist deep. It sucked at boots. It swallowed equipment. In some sectors, men drowned in it. They stepped into shell holes filled with liquid mud and simply disappeared. The rats were everywhere. Massive rats, bold and numerous, fed fat on the dead. They ran through the trenches at night, over sleeping men, through rations, into dugouts. They gnawed on corpses in no man's land. Some were as big as cats. You could hear them in the darkness, scurrying and squeaking, and there was nothing you could do about them. The lice were inescapable. They lived in the seams of uniforms, in the folds of underwear, in every crevice of clothing. The itching was maddening. Men would spend hours picking them out, squashing them between fingernails, knowing it was futile. The eggs would hatch. The lice would return. It was endless. The smell was indescribable. Decomposing bodies that couldn't be retrieved. Overflowing latrines. Rotting sandbags. Stagnant water. Gangrenous wounds. The particular chemical stench of cordite and poison gas. Men who hadn't bathed in weeks. Living in close quarters, sick and wounded, and dying. Trenchfoot claimed thousands. The constant immersion in cold water rotted the flesh. Feet turned white, then grey, then black. In severe cases, amputation was the only option. Men learned to change their socks constantly, to rub whale oil on their feet, to do anything to keep them dry. It rarely worked, and always, always death. From snipers who watched for any exposed head, from artillery that fell without warning, from raids that came in the night, from disease that spread through the cramped, filthy conditions. This was the Western Front. This was where the men of Europe spent Christmas 1914. Who were they, these men in the trenches? They were regular soldiers and volunteers, professionals who had enlisted before the war, and raw recruits who had signed up in the patriotic fervor of August. They were working-class men from industrial cities, miners, factory workers, clerks, and farmers from rural villages. They were young, so many of them were young, boys of 17 and 18 who had lied about their age to enlist, who had wanted adventure, who had no idea what they were walking into. The British called themselves Tommies. The average British soldier was likely from the industrial Midlands or the slums of London, a man who had joined the army because it offered steady pay and 3 meals a day. The British Expeditionary Force that went to France in August 1914 was small but highly trained. Professional soldiers, many with experience in colonial wars. By December, those professionals had been decimated. The men in the trenches now were a mix of survivors and replacements, learning as they went. The Germans were a mix of professional military and eager volunteers. The German army had a strong tradition of universal conscription. Most German men had military training. The volunteers who had joined in August, many of them students and young professionals, had suffered terribly in the early battles. They called themselves the men of 1914 with a mix of pride and sorrow. The French were defending their homeland. German troops occupied a significant portion of northern France. Industrial regions, mining areas, towns and villages where French families still lived under occupation. The French soldiers had a different motivation than the others. They weren't fighting in a foreign country. They were fighting to reclaim their own soil. Most of these men had never traveled far from home before the war. Most had never seen combat. Most had believed the things they'd been told, that the enemy was brutal, that the cause was just, that the war would be quick. By December, they knew better, but they were still there, still fighting, still dying, and it was almost Christmas. By December, the illusions had died. The war would not be over by Christmas. That much was obvious. The front lines hadn't moved significantly in weeks. Every attack was beaten back. Every gain was temporary. The newspapers at home still talked about imminent victory, but the men in the trenches knew better. 4 months of fighting had already killed hundreds of thousands. The exact numbers were uncertain. Chaos on this scale was hard to count, but the cemeteries were filling. The casualty lists in the newspapers grew longer every day. Towns that had sent off their young men with flags and cheering were now receiving telegrams and learning what war really meant. The men in the trenches had seen things they would never forget. Friends killed beside them, bodies torn apart by artillery, the sounds of the wounded crying for help in no man's land, where no help could reach them. They had learned that war was not adventure. War was mud and blood and fear and boredom and the constant presence of death. No one knew how long it would last. No one could imagine that it would go on for 4 more years, that it would kill millions more, that it would destroy empires, German, Austrian, Ottoman, Russian, that it would redraw the map of the world, that it would plant the seeds for an even worse war a generation later. They only knew that they were cold, that they were tired, that they were far from home, and that it was almost Christmas. December 24th dawned cold and clear along much of the Western Front. The fighting had slowed in the days before Christmas. Not stopped entirely, but slowed. There was an unofficial sense, shared by men on both sides, that Christmas should mean something, even here, even in the trenches, even in the midst of a war that had already killed so many. Some units received packages from home. The British had plum puddings and Princess Mary boxes, small brass tins containing tobacco, chocolate, and a card from the princess herself, sent to every soldier at the front. The men treasured them, not for what they contained, though the cigarettes were welcome, for what they represented. Someone at home was thinking of them. Someone remembered they were human. The Germans received packages too, and among the items sent from home were small Christmas trees, Tannenbäume, miniature versions of the trees that would stand in German parlors on Christmas Eve, decorated with candles and small ornaments. The German tradition of the Christmas tree was older than the British one. It had only been popularized in England after Prince Albert brought the custom from Germany decades earlier. The trees arrived at the front in boxes, small trees, most of them, a foot or two tall, fragile things really, absurd in this context of mud and death. But the German soldiers unpacked them carefully, set them up in their trenches, prepared them for evening. Christmas was coming, whether the war wanted it or not. As darkness fell on Christmas Eve, something strange began to happen along the German lines. Soldiers started placing their small Christmas trees on the parapets of their trenches, the raised edges of earth and sandbag that faced toward the enemy. They positioned them carefully, visible from no man's land, visible from the British trenches beyond. and they lit the candles. One by one, along miles of the German front, small flames flickered to life. Christmas candles on Christmas trees, placed where the enemy could see them. From the British trenches, men watched in confusion. At first, some thought it was a trick, a new German weapon perhaps, signal lights for an attack, something dangerous. Then they realized what they were seeing: Christmas lights. One British soldier later wrote that the effect was like the footlights of a theatre, a line of warm, flickering flames stretching along the horizon, soft against the darkness. Not muzzle flashes, not explosions, just candles, just light. In the trenches, men crowded to the fire steps to look. They pointed and murmured. Some laughed in disbelief. Some felt their eyes sting with unexpected tears. It was the first beautiful thing they'd seen in months. Then the singing started. From the German trenches, voices rose in the cold night air. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, silent night, holy night. The melody was familiar. It was the same tune the British knew, the same carol sung in churches across England. Only the words were different, only the language. The German voices were rough. These weren't trained singers. These were soldiers, exhausted and cold, their throats raw from months of bad air and little water. But they sang anyway. They sang because it was Christmas Eve. They sang because the candles were lit and the trees were up, and for one moment they wanted to feel like men instead of soldiers. British soldiers listened in silence. The sound drifted across no man's land, across the craters and the wire and the unburied dead, and reached ears that had heard nothing but artillery and gunfire for months. Men who had been shooting at each other that morning stood still and listened to their enemies sing a Christmas carol. When the Germans finished, there was a moment of silence, and then British voices answered. The first Noel, rising from the British trenches, carried across the same wasteland, reaching German ears. The British couldn't match the German harmony. They weren't as practiced at group singing. But they sang anyway. They sang because the Germans had sung. They sang because something was happening, something none of them had expected, and they wanted to be part of it. The singing went on for hours in some sectors, back and forth across no man's land. German carols, then British carols. O Tannenbaum, God rest ye merry gentlemen. Es ist ein Ross entsprungen. Hark the herald angels sing. The two sides discovered how much they shared. The melodies were often the same, even when the words were different. Christmas was Christmas. The songs were the songs. Men who couldn't understand each other's speech could understand each other's music. In some sectors, they tried singing together. The same carol, at the same time, in different languages. It didn't quite work. The timing was off. The words didn't match. But it didn't matter. The attempt was what mattered. The reaching across. Shouts began to accompany the carols. Merry Christmas, Englishmen, in accented English. Happy Christmas, Fritz, in reply. The nicknames the soldiers had for each other, Tommy and Fritz, Bosch and Limey, shouted now without malice, almost with affection. You no shoot, we no shoot. The offers came from both directions, informal, unofficial, unsanctioned by anyone in authority, just men calling to other men, proposing something unthinkable. What if we stopped? What if we just stopped? The night was cold. The stars were bright. The candles flickered on the German trees. And somewhere along the line, someone decided to find out what would happen if they did. Someone had to be first. The accounts vary on exactly who it was and exactly where. The truce happened in dozens of sectors along the front, and in each one, someone had to take the first step. Someone had to trust that the enemy wouldn't shoot. In some accounts, it was a German officer who emerged first, carrying a small Christmas tree, waving it above his head as he climbed out of the trench. In others, it was a British soldier responding to shouted invitations, standing up slowly, hands visible and empty. Imagine being that man. You've spent months learning to fear the enemy trench. Any head that appears above the parapet draws sniper fire. Any movement in no man's land means death. You've watched friends die for less than what you're about to do. And now you're climbing out, standing up, walking forward into the open ground. Your heart is pounding. Your hands are shaking. Every instinct screams at you to get down, to take cover, to not be stupid. But the singing has stopped, and it's quiet. And across the way you can see shapes moving, German shapes climbing out of their trench too. They're not shooting, neither are you. You walk forward, they walk forward. The distance closes. 30 yards, 20 yards, 10 yards. And then you're face to face with the enemy. And he's just a man. A young man probably. Tired, cold, muddy, scared maybe. Just like you. He's got a face and hands and eyes that look into yours. He's not a monster. He's not a Hun or a Bosch or whatever the newspapers call them. He's just a man. He extends his hand. You take it. All along the Western Front, in sector after sector, the same scene played out. Men emerged from their trenches and walked into no man's land. Not attacking, not armed, or at least not threatening. Just walking, meeting. The ground they crossed was terrible. Shell craters filled with stagnant water, now frozen over with thin ice that cracked underfoot. Tangles of barbed wire that had to be stepped around or carefully climbed through. Snagging uniforms, scratching exposed skin. Debris from months of fighting. Discarded equipment, broken rifles, the detritus of war. And bodies. The bodies of men who had fallen in the fighting and couldn't be recovered, lying where they had died, some of them for weeks. The frost had preserved them after a fashion. They lay in attitudes of death, sprawled, curled, reaching, reminders of what this ground had seen. The living picked their way past the dead to reach each other. It was not an easy walk. They met in the middle. The handshakes came first, formal, almost awkward. Officers saluted each other. Enlisted men extended hands that had been gripping rifles an hour earlier. What do you say to a man you were trying to kill yesterday? What do you say to a man who was trying to kill you? A man whose artillery might have killed your friends, whose snipers might have ended lives you cared about. But the awkwardness faded quickly. It had to. Standing in the middle of no man's land, surrounded by the evidence of war, there was no room for pretense. Everyone was cold. Everyone was tired. Everyone was far from home on Christmas. Someone smiled. Someone laughed. A nervous laugh released tension. Someone produced a cigarette and offered it. The ice broke. Within minutes, the conversations were flowing. Broken German, broken English, hand gestures and pantomime when words failed. It didn't matter that they couldn't always understand each other. They found ways to communicate. Where are you from? I worked in London before the war. You did? Where? A hotel. near Victoria Station. I know that area. The world before the war. Jobs and cities and normal life. That's what they talked about. Not the war, not the fighting. The world before, when a German might work in a London hotel and nobody thought anything of it. When borders were easy and nations weren't trying to destroy each other. Today, in no man's land, they remembered that world. Today, they were just men, meeting in a frozen field, trying to remember what normal felt like. They exchanged whatever they had. Cigarettes were the universal currency. German tobacco was different from British, stronger, wrapped differently. The men traded cigarette for cigarette, comparing brands, debating quality. It didn't matter that they couldn't read each other's labels. The smoke was warm in their lungs. The nicotine was a small comfort against the cold. Food was shared. The British plum puddings were exotic to German tongues. German sausages and black bread were strange to British palates. They ate each other's rations and made exaggerated faces of appreciation or disgust, and everyone laughed. Chocolate changed hands, so did schnapps and whiskey. Someone had beer, someone had wine. Small bottles passed around, sipped in the cold. They traded souvenirs, uniform buttons. The British buttons looked different from the German ones. Cap badges, belt buckles. One British soldier gave up his balaclava and received a German Pickelhaube helmet in return, the spiked leather helmet that seemed to symbolize German militarism. He posed with it and everyone laughed. Addresses were exchanged. Men wrote down their home addresses, their families' names. "Write to me after the war," they said. "Come visit. We'll have a proper drink." After the war. As if the war would end. As if they would all survive. As if this strange friendship could outlast the artillery and the gas and the machine guns that waited in the days ahead. The photographs came out carefully. They were precious, these pictures from home. Carried in breast pockets, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from the damp. Small portraits mostly. Studio photographs taken before the war, or in the brief visits home that some men had managed. "This is my wife. She's beautiful. Thank you. Do you have a wife?" "A fiancée. See, this is her. We were supposed to marry in September." The photographs passed from hand to hand. German soldiers looking at pictures of British families. British soldiers looking at pictures of German children. Women in Sunday dresses standing stiff and formal before painted backdrops. Babies in christening gowns. Elderly parents, proud and worried. These were the people they were fighting for. These were the people who waited at home, who wrote letters, who prayed every night for their safe return. The German soldiers had people like that. The British soldiers had people like that. Looking at each other's photographs, they realized how much they had in common. More in common with each other, maybe, than with the generals and politicians who had sent them here. A British soldier later wrote that looking at a German man's family picture was the moment the war stopped making sense to him. "He had a daughter," the soldier wrote, "same age as mine. What were we doing out here? What were any of us doing?" The officers faced a dilemma. Some participated fully in the truce. They walked out into no man's land alongside their men, met their German counterparts, exchanged salutes and handshakes and gifts. They saw what was happening as a temporary aberration, a Christmas grace that didn't threaten military discipline. War was war, but Christmas was Christmas. The men needed this. Others were horrified. Fraternization with the enemy was against regulations. It undermined the hatred that made men willing to kill. If soldiers started seeing the enemy as human, as friends even, How could they be expected to go back to shooting them? Some officers stayed in their dugouts, refusing to participate, pretending not to see. Some ordered their men to stop. Few were obeyed. Most officers fell somewhere in between. They came out, they observed, they perhaps shook a few hands, but they kept a worried eye on the situation. They knew they'd have to answer for this. They knew the high command would not be pleased. Junior officers were the most likely to participate. They were young, often not much older than their men, and they shared the same exhaustion, the same disillusionment, the same longing for home. They understood what this moment meant. Senior officers, farther from the front, tended to disapprove. But they weren't there. They were in headquarters, in warm rooms, drinking cognac and planning the next attack. They didn't see the candles or hear the carols. They only heard about it afterward, and they were furious. No image of the Christmas truce is more iconic than the football match. British and German soldiers facing off not with rifles, but with a ball. A game instead of a battle. Sport instead of slaughter. It's the detail that everyone remembers. The moment that has been reproduced in films and advertisements and Christmas cards. Two armies playing football in no man's land. But did it happen? This question has occupied historians for decades. The football match has become almost mythical, a symbol of the truce's humanity, its spontaneity, its impossible grace. Symbols like that attract embellishment. They grow in the telling. The question is, what actually occurred? Multiple accounts mention football. Letters home from soldiers, written in the days after Christmas, describe games being played. Diaries kept by men who were there include references to kicking a ball around. The evidence isn't fabricated. Something happened. But the details are vague. The locations are uncertain. The participants often can't remember exactly where on the front they were, or what units the Germans belonged to, or how long the game lasted. There's no photograph, no definitive account that everyone agrees on, no match report with a final score. What we have is scattered testimony. A British soldier mentions a game in one sector. A German soldier mentions one in another. Neither can be perfectly corroborated. The football match is real in the sense that football was played. It's uncertain in the sense that we don't know exactly what that looked like. Here's what probably happened. No man's land was not a football pitch. It was a wasteland, cratered by months of artillery fire, muddy, strewn with debris, uneven, and in many places still containing the bodies of the dead. The shell holes alone made running difficult. The barbed wire, even trampled down, caught at boots and ankles. You couldn't play a proper match there. You couldn't have two 11-man teams with goals and a referee and halftime and tactical formations. But you could kick a ball around. Someone, somewhere, had a football. Maybe it came from home in a Christmas package. British civilians sent all kinds of things to the front, and a football wasn't impossible. Maybe it had been in someone's kit since August, carried through the retreat and the trenches, a relic of the world before. Maybe it was improvised. Some accounts describe bundles of rags tied together into a rough ball shape, or empty tins stuffed with cloth. When you want to play badly enough, you find a way. And men kicked it. Germans and British together, mixed up, not really forming teams. More of a kickabout than a match. 20 or 30 men, maybe more, chasing a ball through the frozen mud of no man's land. Some in German grey, some in British khaki. Indistinguishable after a few minutes, everyone caked in the same mud. They weren't keeping score. They weren't trying to win. They were just playing, running, chasing, kicking. The simple physical joy of sport, which they hadn't experienced in months. The chance to move without being shot at. The chance to use their bodies for something other than fighting and surviving. The men were exhausted, malnourished, wearing heavy boots caked with mud. They hadn't run for sport in months. Hadn't run at all except in combat, in fear. The match would have been slow, clumsy, interrupted by laughter and confusion and the need to catch breath. But they played. In the worst place on earth, surrounded by death, on ground soaked with the blood of their comrades, they played a game. That's what the football match really was. Not the FA Cup final. Not a proper match between national teams. Not the image you see in commemorative advertisements with neat goals and clean uniforms. Just men, kicking a ball, being human. Did anyone win? Various accounts claim various results. Germany 3, England 2. A draw. No score kept at all. The truth is that no one cared enough to remember accurately because no one cared about winning. The point wasn't the score. The point wasn't victory. War was about victory. This wasn't war. This was its opposite. For one brief hour, enemies competed without trying to kill each other. They ran and shouted and chased a ball through the mud, and when someone scored, or something that counted as scoring, they cheered, all of them, regardless of which side the ball went in. The final score of the Christmas Truce football match is, it happened. The final result is, humanity won. At least for that day. One of the great horrors of trench warfare was what happened to the dead. When men fell in no man's land, killed in attacks, caught by machine guns, cut down by artillery, their bodies often couldn't be recovered. The same fire that killed them made retrieval suicidal. Crawl out to bring back a fallen friend, and you'd likely become a corpse yourself. So the bodies stayed where they fell. They lay in the open, in the mud and the wire. They decomposed in sight of their comrades, who could do nothing but watch. The smell drifted into the trenches. The sight haunted men who had to look at it every day. By Christmas, some bodies had been lying there for weeks, since the early attacks, before the lines froze into place. Men who had died in October were still out there in December, barely recognizable now, picked at by rats, sinking slowly into the mud. Their friends couldn't bury them, couldn't give them any dignity, couldn't even retrieve their identity discs so their families would know what happened. It was one of the worst things about the trenches. Not just the dying, but the inability to honor the dead. The truce changed that. When the firing stopped and men emerged from their trenches, one of the first things they did was attend to the fallen. Working parties formed on both sides, not to fight, to dig. German soldiers and British soldiers working together, carrying bodies out of no man's land. The dead were laid out in rows. Graves were dug in the frozen ground. Hard work, exhausting work, but work that mattered. German soldiers helped carry British bodies. British soldiers helped dig graves for German dead. They didn't argue about who belonged to which side. The dead were the dead. They all deserved burial. In some sectors, joint services were held. A British chaplain saying prayers over a grave that held men from both armies. A German officer reading from a Bible in German while British soldiers stood with bowed heads. The Lord's Prayer recited in both languages, rising together over the fresh-turned earth. These were Christian nations. These were Christian soldiers. Whatever else divided them, they shared a faith that said the dead deserved respect. That burial was sacred. That even enemies were brothers in the eyes of God. For a few hours, they acted like it. These weren't strangers being buried. The British soldiers carrying bodies often recognized them: friends, tent mates, men they'd trained with, shipped out with, fought beside. Men who had been lying out there for weeks while their comrades could do nothing. The chance to finally bury them was a release. Some soldiers broke down during the burials. Months of grief, months of helplessness, finally finding an outlet. They stood over the graves of men they had known and wept openly, not caring who saw. The Germans didn't mock them. The Germans understood. They had their own dead to mourn. There wasn't much talking during the burials, not the cheerful chatter of the gift exchanges or the football matches. This was somber, sacred. Men worked in silence or near silence, broken only by the sound of shovels and the murmured prayers. When it was done, when the graves were filled and the crosses erected, men stood together over the mounds of earth. Germans and British, side by side, looking down at the dead. They didn't need to share a language to understand this moment. They were burying their friends. They were acknowledging the cost. They were doing, together, what the war had made impossible to do alone. Frank Richards was a private in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. He was a regular soldier, a professional, enlisted before the war, experienced in ways the volunteers weren't. He'd been in the trenches since the beginning. He'd seen the worst of it. His account of the Christmas truce, written years later in his memoir, Old Soldiers Never Die, is one of the most detailed we have. He describes the German voices singing carols on Christmas Eve, the lights on the trees, the gradual, cautious emergence from the trenches, the meetings in no man's land. "We met in the middle of no man's land," he wrote. Their officers were also in no man's land, mixing with our officers. He describes exchanging cigarettes with German soldiers, learning that one of them had been a barber in London before the war, working in the West End. They knew the same streets. They'd probably walked past each other without knowing it. "We were all friends," Richards wrote. "There was nothing we couldn't have done together. It was like a dream." A dream. That's how many veterans described it. Something unreal. Something that couldn't have happened, except that it did. Richard survived the war. He went home. He wrote his book. But he never forgot that Christmas. Never stopped wondering what it meant. Kurt Zamisch was a German schoolteacher serving as an officer on the Western Front. He kept a diary throughout the war, careful entries, written in his precise handwriting, documenting what he saw and felt. His entry for Christmas 1914 is remarkable. He describes the preparations on Christmas Eve, the trees being placed on the parapets, the candles being lit, the singing that began at dusk and continued into the night. He describes the emergence into no man's land, the British soldiers walking toward them, the hesitation on both sides, and then the handshakes, the smiles, the strange relief of meeting face to face. "I showed my photographs to the British soldiers," he wrote. "They showed me theirs. We talked about our homes, our families. One man had visited Germany before the war, had been to Munich. He remembered it fondly. The strangeness of it struck him. It was as though we were in another world," he wrote, "as though the war had been a nightmare and we had finally woken up." But he knew the nightmare wasn't over. He knew they would go back to fighting. He wrote about that too. The knowledge that this moment couldn't last, that the artillery would resume, that the men sharing photographs today would be shooting at each other tomorrow. Zamish survived the war. He went back to teaching. He lived to be an old man. But his diary entry for Christmas 1914 remained one of the most important things he ever wrote. Captain Edward Hulse of the Scots Guards was a young officer from an aristocratic family. He wrote detailed letters home to his mother throughout his time at the front. His letters from Christmas 1914 are vivid and immediate, written while the truce was still happening. "This has been one of the most memorable days of my life," he wrote on December 25th. "The Germans have been singing carols, and our men have been joining in. We've actually been out in no man's land, shaking hands with them." He described meeting German officers, men of his own class, men who spoke excellent English, who had traveled, who seemed cultured and civilized. One had been to Britain. Another asked about mutual acquaintances in London society. "It's the most extraordinary thing," Hulse wrote. "They're just like us, just soldiers doing their duty, wishing they were home." He exchanged names and addresses with some of the German officers, promised to look them up after the war, made plans that assumed survival, assumed peace, assumed a future. 3 months later, Captain Edward Hulse was killed in action at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle. He was 25 years old. The addresses he exchanged that Christmas were never used. The visits never happened. He became one of the millions of letters that simply stopped coming. Most of the men who participated in the Christmas truce left no written record. They were ordinary soldiers, working-class men, many with limited education, who didn't keep diaries or write detailed letters. They experienced something extraordinary and then went back to their lives, which mostly meant going back to the war. We know the truce happened because some accounts survive, letters that were kept, diaries that were preserved, memoirs written years later by veterans who couldn't forget. But those accounts represent only a fraction of those who were there. For every Frank Richards who wrote a book, there were hundreds of men who never told their stories, who shared cigarettes with Germans on Christmas 1914 and never mentioned it to anyone, who carried the memory quietly, privately, for the rest of their lives. Some died before they could tell anyone. The war had 4 more years to kill them, and it killed so many. Some survived, but stayed silent. Maybe the memory was too strange. Maybe it didn't fit with what they'd been told about the enemy, about the war, about why they were fighting. Maybe it was easier to forget. We'll never know how many men stood in no man's land that Christmas, never know all their names or all their stories. We only know that they were there, thousands of them, ordinary men, doing something extraordinary, and then going back to war. The truce didn't end all at once. It had started spontaneously, in different sectors at different times, and it ended the same way. Some places saw only a few hours of peace on Christmas Day before the shooting resumed. Others maintained the truce for several days, into December 26th, 27th, even into the new year. In a few sectors, informal arrangements persisted for weeks, an unspoken agreement not to fire during mealtimes, a mutual understanding that snipers would aim high. Not a truce, exactly, but a diminished hostility. A memory of Christmas that softened the war's edges, at least for a while. But everywhere, eventually, the killing started again. The war was still the war. The orders still came down. The trenches still faced each other across no man's land. The reasons for fighting, whatever they were, whatever anyone believed them to be, hadn't changed. Christmas was over. In many sectors, officers from both sides arranged a formal end to the truce. They would meet in no man's land one final time. shake hands, agree on a time, 8 in the morning, say, or noon, a specific hour when the war would resume. "We will begin firing at noon," a German officer might say. "Understood," his British counterpart would reply. "We'll do the same." A handshake, a salute, a final exchange of cigarettes perhaps, then back to the trenches. In some places, warning shots were fired first. A rifle discharged into the air or a burst of machine gun fire aimed deliberately high. A signal that the truce was over, that it was time to take cover, that the next shots would be aimed to kill. And then the war continued. Men who had shared photographs of their children went back to trying to kill each other. Men who had buried the dead together went back to creating more dead. The same men who had played football in no man's land were shooting across it by nightfall. How did they do it? How did they go back? They did it because there was no alternative, because the machine of war was bigger than any of them, because refusing to fight meant court-martial and execution, because their friends were still counting on them, because the enemy, however human he had seemed on Christmas, was still the enemy. They did it because they had no choice. When word of the truce reached the high command, the reaction was fury. This was exactly what military authorities feared. Soldiers discovering that the enemy was human. Soldiers refusing to hate. Soldiers making their own decisions about when to fight and when to stop. War required hatred. It required dehumanization. It required soldiers to believe that the enemy was evil, was barbaric, was something less than human. Without that belief, how could you ask men to kill? How could you ask them to die? The Christmas truce proved that the hatred wasn't natural. It had to be manufactured, maintained, enforced. Left to themselves, soldiers would recognize each other's humanity. They would stop fighting. They would sing carols and exchange cigarettes and play football. The generals couldn't allow that. Orders came down from both sides. The truce was not to be discussed. It was not to be repeated. Any future attempt at fraternization would be severely punished. Officers who had allowed it to happen were reprimanded. Some were reassigned. New procedures were put in place. Artillery barrages would be scheduled for Christmas Day in future years, making any approach to no man's land suicidal. Trench raids would be ordered during holidays, forcing contact to be violent. The machine would not be stopped again. The men had proven they could choose peace. The generals needed to make sure they never chose it again. There were attempts to recreate the truce in 1915, scattered efforts in isolated sectors by soldiers who remembered what had happened the year before, men who tried to start the singing again, who put up Christmas trees, who called out greetings across no man's land. They failed. The commands on both sides had prepared. Artillery bombardments made the approaches deadly. Officers had explicit orders to prevent any contact. Soldiers who attempted to fraternize faced immediate punishment. Courts-martial, imprisonment, even execution for desertion in the face of the enemy. The war itself had hardened too. By Christmas 1915, the men had seen too much. Poison gas had been introduced at Ypres in April. The slaughter had intensified. Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, places that became synonymous with death. The men of 1914 were mostly gone, replaced by new recruits who had never known a time before the horror, and the hatred had deepened. In 1914, many soldiers still saw the enemy as fellow soldiers, fellow men, caught up in the same catastrophe. By 1915, The enemy was the man who had gassed your friend, the man who had machine-gunned your battalion, the man who had killed and killed and killed for a year. The conditions that made the Christmas truce possible existed only once. After 1914, they never existed again. The war went on until November 1918, 4 more years after that Christmas Eve. 4 more years of trenches, of mud, of rats, of death. 4 more years of artillery barrages and gas attacks and machine guns and all the industrialized killing that modern warfare could devise. The men who shared cigarettes in no man's land on Christmas 1914 went back to shooting at each other on December the 26th, and they kept shooting, or being shot, for 4 more years. The battles that followed dwarfed anything that had come before. Verdun in 1916, where the German command explicitly designed an operation to bleed France white. The battle lasted 10 months. 300,000 men died. The French and Germans bled each other for 10 months over a few miles of lunar landscape. And when it was done, the front lines were essentially unchanged. The Somme in 1916, where the British launched their own massive offensive. The first day alone, July 1st, 1916, the British suffered 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead before sunset. Young men who had enlisted in the patriotic fervor of 1914 now cut down in rows by German machine guns. The battle continued for months. By the end, over 1 million men were dead or wounded on both sides. The ground gained could be measured in yards. Passchendaele, in 1917, where the mud became as deadly as the enemy. Men drowned in it. Artillery turned the ground to soup, and soldiers sank and disappeared. The wounded, unable to move, slipped beneath the surface and suffocated. The battle lasted from July to November, nearly 500,000 casualties. The village of Passchendaele was captured, lost, recaptured. Its name became synonymous with futility. The truce of 1914 became a memory, then a legend, then something the veterans didn't talk about. It didn't fit with what came after. How do you explain that you played football with men you later killed? How do you make sense of a war where enemies could be friends for a day and then go back to slaughter? Some veterans never spoke of the truce. Some couldn't bear to remember. Some remembered it as the last moment before everything became unbearable. The last moment when the war still seemed like something that could be survived with humanity intact. By the time the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, approximately 17 million people were dead. Soldiers and civilians, men and women and children. From bullet and shell and gas and disease and starvation. From every nation involved, and dozens were by the end. The British Empire lost nearly 1 million, 900,000 men who never came home, whose names are carved on monuments in every village and town in Britain. Germany lost over 2 million. France lost nearly 1.4 million. Russia lost nearly 2 million before leaving the war in 1917. Austria-Hungary, Italy, the Ottoman Empire, Serbia, which lost 1/4 of its entire population, an entire generation decimated. The men who should have been fathers and builders and leaders buried in the mud of France and Belgium and a dozen other fronts. The men who sang carols together on Christmas Eve 1914, who exchanged addresses and promised to write after the war. How many of them survived to keep those promises? We don't know. We can't know. Most of them left no records. But statistically, the odds were against them. The war had 4 years to kill them. For most, it probably did. For years after the war, the Christmas truce lived mainly in the memories of the men who'd been there. Some spoke of it, some wrote about it. Frank Richards included it in his memoir. Other veterans mentioned it in letters, in interviews, in conversations with family members who weren't sure they believed it. It seemed too good to be true, too hopeful. In a war defined by suffering and waste, this moment of grace felt almost like a fairy tale. Something people wanted to believe had happened, whether it had or not. But it had happened. The evidence accumulated as historians began to look for it. The letters and diaries, the photographs, the testimony of surviving veterans. The truce was real, and gradually, it became part of how we remember the First World War. Not as unrelenting darkness, but as darkness interrupted. Not as pure horror, but as horror that couldn't completely extinguish humanity. The Christmas truce became proof that even in the worst circumstances, people were capable of something better. Books were written, songs were composed, films were made. The truce entered the culture, a story told every December, a reminder of what happened a century ago when enemies decided, just for a moment, to be human. The Christmas truce raises uncomfortable questions. If soldiers could simply decide to stop fighting, if they could meet in no man's land and recognize each other's humanity, share cigarettes, play football, bury the dead together, why did they go back to killing each other? Why did they obey the orders to resume? Why did the war continue for 4 more years after men on both sides proved, demonstrated, made absolutely clear that they didn't want to fight it? These questions don't have easy answers. They challenge comfortable assumptions about war, about patriotism, about duty, about the inevitability of violence between nations. The Christmas truce shows that the violence wasn't inevitable. It could be stopped. It was stopped for a day. The men in the trenches had the power to end it, but they didn't. They couldn't. Something larger than them, the machinery of war, the weight of nations, the expectations of generals and politicians and civilian populations, pushed them back to their trenches and their rifles. The truce reveals both the possibility of peace and the forces that make peace so difficult to sustain. The men returned to their trenches and resumed fighting for the same reasons soldiers always fight. Duty. They had enlisted or been conscripted, and they had obligations to their countries, to their units, to their comrades. Abandoning those obligations meant betraying everything they'd been taught to value. Fear. Refusing to fight was desertion. Desertion was punishable by death, even if a man wanted to stop fighting. The consequences of stopping were immediate and certain. The consequences of continuing were terrible, but diffuse. You might die, but you might not. You definitely would be shot for desertion. Loyalty. The man next to you in the trench was your friend, your brother, in the way that soldiers become brothers. You couldn't abandon him. You couldn't refuse to fight while he was still fighting. You stayed because he stayed. He stayed because you stayed. Habit. After months in the trenches, fighting was what you did. It was the structure of your days. The war had become normal in a horrible way. The truce was the aberration. Going back to war was going back to routine. 1 million men can't simultaneously decide to stop fighting. They can only put down their guns one by one, and one by one they can be arrested, court-martialed, shot. The Christmas truce happened because, for a brief moment, the system broke down. The controls failed. Men acted as individuals instead of as soldiers. But the system reasserted itself. The controls resumed, and the war went on. The Christmas truce reveals something important about war. Not that war is senseless, though it often is. Not that enemies can be friends, though they sometimes can. But that war requires constant effort to maintain. The hatred has to be manufactured. The propaganda has to be renewed. The dehumanization of the enemy has to be reinforced every single day. Without that effort, soldiers will recognize each other's humanity. They'll stop killing. They'll start talking. The Christmas truce happened because, for one night, the machinery of war stopped working. The propaganda fell silent. The hatred relaxed. The men saw each other clearly, not as Huns or Tommies, not as enemies, but as people. And when they saw each other clearly, they chose peace. That they couldn't sustain that choice. That the machinery restarted and ground on for 4 more years and killed millions more doesn't diminish the moment. It makes it more precious, more fragile, more human. It started with a song, Stille Nacht, Silent Night, a carol written almost a century earlier by an Austrian priest, composed for a church service in a small village near Salzburg. It had spread across the German-speaking world and beyond, translated into dozens of languages, sung in churches everywhere. On Christmas Eve 1914, German soldiers sang it in their trenches, and British soldiers, hearing the familiar melody, recognized it instantly. The words were different, but the song was the same. Music crossed where bullets couldn't. Music bridged what war had broken. A song did what generals and politicians couldn't do. It made enemies into men. It reminded them of home, of peace, of everything they were fighting to return to. It created, for a moment, a common ground that wasn't no man's land. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. It wasn't calm on the Western Front. It wasn't bright. But for one night, men pretended it could be. They sang as if peace were possible. They sang as if they weren't going to kill each other tomorrow. And in the singing, something changed. Something shifted. Something became possible that hadn't been possible before. The image that remains, candles on Christmas trees, flickering along the German trenches, soft light in the midst of darkness, warm flames against the cold December night, a line of tiny lights stretching along the horizon, visible from the British positions, impossible and beautiful. That's what started it. Not orders from above, not negotiations between governments, just candles, just light, a simple human gesture that said, "It's Christmas. Even here, even in this hell, it's Christmas." Men emerging from ditches to meet in the space between, hands extended across the mud and wire, gifts exchanged, cigarettes, chocolate, photographs of home, a football kicked through the frozen wasteland, graves dug together for the shared dead. The Christmas truce lasted a day, or a few days, or in some places, just a few hours. Then it ended. The war went on. The killing resumed. The machines of death briefly paused, started up again, and ran for 4 more years. By the time they stopped, 17 million people were dead. Empires had fallen. The map of Europe had been redrawn. A generation of young men had been fed into the machinery of war and ground to nothing. But for one night, one cold, clear night in December 1914, the guns fell silent. The carols rose, and men who were supposed to be enemies discovered they were just men. Fathers and sons, brothers and friends, workers and students and farmers, far from home on Christmas. People who loved and feared and hoped, just like everyone else. People who wanted to survive. People who wanted to go home. That's worth remembering. Every Christmas Eve, when the carols start and the candles are lit, it's worth remembering what happened in the trenches in 1914. Worth remembering that peace was possible, that humanity survived, even there, that even in the darkest times, in the worst places, people can choose something better. The men of 1914 chose it once. They put down their weapons, climbed out of their trenches, and walked toward each other instead of shooting at each other. For one day, they chose to be human. Maybe the lesson of the Christmas truce is that we always have that choice. That war isn't inevitable. That hatred isn't permanent. That even in no man's land, there's room for grace. They chose peace once. Maybe we can choose it again. Until next time.